So we're going to now show you some of the Virginia Tech varieties that are up and coming and previous varieties briefly. You'll notice on the signs that we have data, the variety name, data for heading date, days from January 1st to heading, yield percent mean of the test mean. The mean yield was 83.4 bushels, so the test mean would be 100%. So essentially you can see here that Hilliard had a yield that was similar to the overall trial mean. Heading date was 120. The average heading date for the whole test over a 2-year period was 120 days, so Hilliard's average heading. Average test weight over the 2019 test was 57.7. So you can see that Hilliard was close to average on test weight, and non-toxin content from Fusarium infested grain was 10 parts per million, and that was average. So essentially Hilliard generally overall had average performance for heading date, yield, test weight, and non-toxin last year. So these varieties we showed earlier in the historical variety trials. These show larger plots of them. Liberty 5658 is, they're looking at it as a replacement for Hilliard in this region. 2 days earlier heading than Hilliard, a little bit higher yielding, significantly higher test weight. So the plus signs on the signs indicate performance significantly above the test average, and a minus is significantly below the test average. So it's earlier heading and has significantly higher test weight, and as you can see, the DON is equal to the test average. So the next two are the varieties that we got approval to release this year. 13 VTK 429-3, which was jointly developed with KWS. Essentially you can see that heading date is full season, 122 days, 4% above the trial average in yield, and test weight was significantly higher than the trial average at 58.4, and 7 parts per billion DON, which was lower than average. 16W202, earlier heading than average, 4% above the test average on yield. Test weight was below the test average at 56.7, and 8 parts per million DON, which is lower than average. The next two lines are ones that we are hopefully considering for release in 2021. These varieties have a broad range of disease resistance, including improvements in Fusarium head blight resistance. They have resistance to Hessian fly, leaf rust, stripe rust, and mildew. They also have very high test weight. So the first one is 17W74, earlier than average on heading, 2% higher than average on yield, significantly higher on test weight, and DON was 6 parts per million compared to trial average of 10. The other, its sister line, 17W75, again early heading, 6% higher than the test average on yield, higher than trial average on test weight, and DON was 3 parts per million. So basically this is showing good improvements in all of these traits. 17W176 did very well in the southern states last year. You can see its early heading. Yield was 6% above the test average, higher than average on test weight, and DON lower than the trial average at 6 parts per million. The program has been focused heavily on improving scab resistance in both the wheat and barley programs. And one thing that we've been doing is trying to use marker-assisted breeding to combine or pyramid multiple disease resistance genes for Fusarium head blight. And this line gives an example where we're trying to incorporate FHB1, which is the major gene for resistance to Fusarium head blight, along with other unique genes such as those found in Jamestown and also Noose and Bess. So essentially this is one of many lines that we have in the program now that have multiple scab resistance genes, so we're just looking for the best combination of traits, including scab resistance. So this was the earliest heading line in the state test last year, 115 days from January 1st to heading. Yield was equal to the trial average, very high test weight, 59 pounds per bushel, and also Don was at 9. Another line where we've tried to combine FHB resistance. Again, this line 2508 is earlier heading than average, 6% above the trial average, so it has better yield than the previous line we looked at. Test weight is above average at 58.6, and the Don is at 8 parts per million. So as I mentioned in the last stop, we have been working on improving and identifying nitrogen use efficiency in wheat. Kyle Brazier was one of my recent students who looked at nitrogen use efficiency extensively in trials, and this line, this double haploid line that was developed in collaboration with Lima grain, basically was shown to have high nitrogen use efficiency. It's a full season line, 122 days. Yield was 3% above the test average. Average test weight at 58. Also, this line has shown very good resistance to Fusarium head blight with a Don of 5 parts per million. So now we're going to go through some of the commercial varieties through private companies that have been entered in our state variety trial. So basically I'm going to show you the varieties that were tested last year and also are in the test again this year, so that we have data, and you can see the data on the signs. Also, you can go to the Extension Small Grains website where you can see the full reports of the official variety trials each year. So the first is a Lima grain variety, LCS 11719. Again, 122 days, so it's full season. You see the plus sign means it's higher than the test average. 2% above the trial mean on yield. Test weight was average, and Don was 15 compared to the trial average of 10 parts per million. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that the data we generate on Fusarium head blight is in an inoculated, mist-irrigated nursery. So these values are probably significantly higher than what you would see in these plots or in a field setting. The next variety is Syngenta Richie. Early heading, 117 days, 7% above the trial average. Test weight was average at 57.1 and Don of 17. One of the highest yielding varieties in the state test last year was SY Viper, also early heading, and has very good test weight and Don of 6. So this variety shows a good combination of characteristics. So we're looking at these varieties, if you haven't noticed, in groups by companies. So the next Syngenta line is 547. Average in heading, yield was lower than average, test weight was average, and Don was 10. Syngenta 576 is actually was the latest heading variety at 125 days. So there's a 10-day spread between the earliest heading variety at 115 and this variety at 125. Yield was lower than the test average, as was test weight. Don was at 7 parts per million. This is Syngenta 007, which we like to say is James Bond. This one is early heading, 2% above the trial average, average test weight, and Don of 9. The next group of varieties are Featherstone varieties, local Virginia group that market varieties. Featherstone 31 is full season, average in yield, test weight is average, and 9 parts per million on Don. Featherstone 125, a full season, 5% above the trial average in yield. It had the highest test weight in last year's state trial among these varieties. Don was at 12. The next two varieties are marketed under the brand name Local Wheat. 2848 is full season, slightly below average on yield and test weight, and Don was at 6. Local Wheat 2958, full season, 3% above the trial average on yield, average test weight, and Don at 4. So showing both of these showing fairly good resistance to fusarium. So the next group of lines that we're going to look at are Agra Max varieties. The first one is 415. Average on heading date, 3% above the trial average on yield, higher than average test weight, and below the average for Don at 9. Agra Max 473, full season heading, average in yield, below average in test weight, and less Don than average. Agra Max 495 is average in heading date, 3% above the trial average in yield, significantly higher than average in test weight, and below average in Don toxin. Agra Max 1902, full season, 5% above the trial average in yield, below average test weight, and average on Don toxin content. One is Cropland variety CP9606. It was average in heading date at 120, 2% above the trial average in yield, below average in test weight, and had less Don than average at 6 parts per million. So next we're looking at Dynagro varieties. This one we saw earlier, Laverne, below average in heading date, so earlier, 4% above the trial average in yield, test weight was average, and 9 parts per million Don, so 1 part less than average. Dynagro 9941, full season at 122 days, 6% above average in yield, below average in test weight, and Don just below the trial average at 9. Dynagro 9932, again full season, right about average on yield, higher than average in test weight, and you can see low Don at 4, so quite a bit lower than the average. Dynagro 9772, 1 day earlier than average, 1% higher on yield, below average in test weight, and again fairly low Don toxin content. So the last variety marketed by Donagro is Shirley. Full season, 1% higher than the trial average on yield, lower than average on test weight, and 17 on Don. Mercer brand, this is MBX 969. Full season variety, 1% higher than average on yield, lower than average test weight. Don was 7 and lower than average. MBX 17M245 has been a high yielding variety. Average heading date 6% higher than the trial average, test weight slightly lower than average, and Don at 12. Next we go into the Progeny Varieties. This is Bullet, full season, lower than average on yield last year, lower than average on test weight, but showed low Don toxin content. Blaze, average in heading date, 5% higher than the trial average in yield, average on test weight, and 4 on Don toxin content, so quite a bit lower than average. So still looking at Progeny Varieties, Berkeley, early heading, significantly earlier heading than average, 1% higher than trial average on yield, test weight at 57, somewhat below the trial average. Don toxin was 24. So this variety is kind of interesting in that basically, even though the field symptoms don't show high FHB, it tends to have higher Don. These are Progeny experimental lines, 18.2, earlier heading than average, 1% above the trial average in yield, higher than average on test weight, and Don at 7. Progeny experimental 18.7, average on heading date, significantly higher on yield at 8% above the trial average for yield, higher on test weight, significantly higher, and Don was 12 compared to the trial average of 10. Progeny 18-8, full season variety, 10% above the trial average in yield, so this one had very good yield potential. Test weight was average, Don was 15 compared to the trial average of 10. So now we move into the Southern Harvest varieties. SH7200 is earlier than average heading, somewhat lower on yield. Test weight is average, and Don was 16, so higher than average. Southern Harvest 7510 is full season, around average on yield, test weight average, and slightly lower than average on Don toxin. Southern Harvest 4400, full season variety, below average in yield last year, test weight was average, 7 on Don toxin. Now we move into the USG varieties. USG 3118 is early heading, a little bit lower than average on yield, test weight significantly higher than average, and Don was 1 part less below the average. So one thing to keep in mind is grain yields are based on the length of the grain fill period. So the early heading varieties have a shorter grain fill period, and so yields are generally lower for early heading varieties than later heading varieties. Also, grain yields are dependent heavily on environment. Basically, if you have a long, cool grain fill period, you're generally going to have higher yields than a hot grain fill period. So we're starting off in May. It's pretty cool this morning. So if temperatures remain cool, hopefully we'll have record yields this year. So continuing the USG varieties, USG 3316, again full season, significantly later than average on heading, 8% above the trial average in yield, so that's very good. Average test weight, and Don was 1 below the trial average. USG 3329, earlier than average on heading, 5% above the trial average on yield, average test weight, and Don was below average. USG 3790, full season variety, 7% above the trial average in yield, test weight was average. Don was significantly higher than average on this variety. USG 3895, again full season, 4% above the trial average in yield, test weight below average. Don was 1 part per million above average. USG 3536, full season variety, below average yield last year, below average test weight, but very low Don content. USG 3458, average in heading, 6% above trial average in yield, test weight below average. Don was below average at 6 versus 10. So now we move into the Pioneer brand varieties. 26R59 has had very excellent yield record over the past several years. Average to early in heading, 10% above the trial average in yield last year, average on test weight, and Don was at 7, which was lower than the trial average. Pioneer 26R45, full season, 2% above the trial average in yield, average in test weight at 58, and quite low Don at 2 parts per million. Pioneer 26R10 has been around a long time, but it continues to perform well. It's kind of one of those workhorse varieties. Full season heading, 6% above the trial average in yield, below average in test weight, below average in Don toxin content. Now we move into varieties marketed by Mid-Atlantic Seeds. This is MAS 67, average in heading, a little bit below average in yield, test weight was below average, and this was one that had very low Don toxin content at 1 part per million. MAS 106, one of the earliest heading varieties in the trial at 115 days, below average in yield, significantly below average in yield, average test weight, again very low Don toxin content. MAS 86 was full season variety, 4% above the trial average in yield, below average for test weight, Don toxin below the trial average at 5. MAS 316 was full season, 123 days, below trial average on yield and test weight, and Don toxin of 8. And the last variety is MAS 35, also a full season variety, 2% above the trial average in yield, below average test weight, and Don toxin was 2 parts per million above the trial average. So this concludes the wheat part, the soft wheat part of this presentation. I would like to say thank you. It's been a pleasure serving the region for these past 31 years. Also, keep in mind that when you're selecting varieties, you need to consider multiple years of data and consider the traits that are of highest priority to you. It's very difficult to get all the desired traits in a single package. So Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation.